I'm John Cordray, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I've been licensed since 2007. I've been doing this a long time. Over the years in my practice, I've seen the damage that high-control individuals can do to a person's psyche. But when we look at the extremes, the monsters of history, we often treat them as anomalies. We think that they are unique to their time. Take a look at these two guys, Charles Manson and Keith Raniere. I don't see two different men from two different eras. I see the exact psychological blueprint. Despite being separated by 50 years, they were using the same dark psychology to own the minds of their followers. Today, we're opening the clinical file on Manson and Raniere to unmask the mechanics of coercive control. We're going to look beyond the headlines and the horror stories to understand the how. Because if we can understand how they did it, we can better protect ourselves and the people we love from these patterns in the real world. Take a look at this image of Manson and Raniere. Manson focused on fragmentation. He created chaos, destructive impulses, and coercive control mechanism. He also worked on identity erosion and destructive impulses. Raniere was a little bit different, but similar. He used systematic control, reprogramming protocols, nested hierarchy, financial exploitation, sexual domination, and psychological enslavement. Two different people from two different eras doing the exact same thing to their followers. You probably heard the term cult leader or brainwashing, but in the clinical world, we look for something more specific, a pattern of behavior called coercive control. It's not a single event, it's a process of erosion. It's the slow, methodical stripping away of a person's autonomy until they no longer recognize themselves. In this clinical analysis, we're going to break this down into three specific tactics that both Manson and Raniere mastered. Tactic 1 is isolation. Tactic 2 is gaslighting. And tactic 3, which I think is the most dangerous of all, is exploitation. Let's start with the foundation of their power. Tactic number 1, the architecture of isolation. Psychologically, we know that the human brain is wired for connection. We are social creatures. And cult leaders like Manson and Raniere understood this perfectly, but they used it as a weapon. The first step in any successful system of coercive control isn't fear, it's isolation. Think of it like this. If you want to reprogram a computer, you first have to disconnect it from the network. Manson did this physically. He took young, vulnerable people, mostly women, out to an abandoned, dusty movie set in the California hills. By removing them from their families, their job, and societal norms in the late 60s, he became their only source of truth. Take a look at this image. There is nothing around here, completely remote, and that is exactly what Manson wanted. He wanted to isolate his followers. Keith Raniere didn't need a remote ranch. He used a more modern psychological form of isolation. He operated in plain sight in the suburbs of Albany, but the isolation was just as absolute. He created a closed loop of communication. If you weren't part of his inner circle, you were suppressive. He didn't just take them away from their families. He convinced them that their families were holding back their personal growth. It was their family's fault, and he was their savior. Isolation doesn't require physical distance. It requires a closed loop of communication. As a therapist, I see this red flag often. When someone tells you that the people who love you the most are actually toxic or limiting, they aren't trying to help you grow. They're trying to isolate you so that they become the only voice in your head. There's a specific psychological term for this: environmental control. When a leader controls what you see, who you talk to, and even how much sleep you get, your brain loses its ability to think critically. Manson used drugs and 24-hour sermons to keep his followers in a state of exhaustion. Raniere used high-pressure EMs, or exploration of meaning sessions, that would sometimes last until 4 in the morning. Why does sleep deprivation matter in this clinical file? Because when you're exhausted, your prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain responsible for decision-making, effectively shuts down. You become more suggestible. You stop questioning the absurd and start accepting it as reality. Maybe he has a point. Your brain starts to question your own reality. For both Manson and Raniere, isolation wasn't just about distance. It was about creating a vacuum. And once that vacuum is created, the leader can fill it with whatever they want. And that leads us directly into our second tactic, which is how they managed the minds of those they isolated. Tactic 2, the weaponization of gaslighting. Once the isolation is complete, the next phase begins. And in the clinical world, we call this gaslighting. You probably know this term as well by now. But in the hands of high control leader, it's more than just lying. It's a systematic assault on a person's reality. Think about the term gaslighting for a second. It comes from a play where a husband dims the lights and then tells his wife she's imagining it. But Manson and Raniere didn't just dim the lights. They rearranged the entire house and then told their followers they were enlightened for seeing it that way. As a counselor, I often see clients who have been through this. They describe a feeling of mental fog. This isn't an accident. When Manson told his followers that death is a gift and that evil is just live spelled backwards, he wasn't just being poetic. He was breaking down their moral compass, and he was taking a lifetime of values, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt love your neighbor, and flipping them on their head. Raniere was even more surgical in his gaslighting. He used something he called rational inquiry. If a follower had a concern about his behavior or the group's ethics, he would turn it back on them. He would say things like, "It's just your projection. That's your fear speaking. That's your lack of commitment to your growth." Do you see what happened there? He took a healthy, critical thought and labeled it as clinical symptom of his victim's own weakness. This is one of the most damaging things that a person can do to another human being. But why does this work? It's because something called cognitive dissonance, when your brain holds two conflicting beliefs. For example, I'm a good person, and I'm following a man who is doing bad things. It creates an intense, painful mental tension. To resolve that pain, the brain has to choose one. The leader has successfully isolated you. Your brain often chooses the leader's reality just to stop the pain of conflict. Manson used the helter-skelter prophecy to create a sense of impending doom. He made his followers feel that the only way to be safe was to adopt his chaotic worldview. Raniere used a vanguard persona. He made his followers feel that the only way to be ethical was to obey him. In both cases, the victim's own conscience was used as a trap. They were gaslit into believing that their own instincts were their greatest enemy. When you lose trust in your own eyes and your own heart, you become a shell. And once you're a shell, you're ready for that final, most devastating stage of the clinical file. In psychology, we often talk about boundaries. That healthy relationship is built on mutual respect for those boundaries. But for a high control leader, a boundary is just an obstacle to be removed. Once Manson and Raniere had isolated their followers and dismantled their reality through gaslighting, they moved to the final phase, exploitation. This is the harvest. It's when a leader stops pretending to be a mentor and starts acting like a predator. But here is the psychological twist in this. They make the victims believe that being exploited is actually a form of sacrifice or enlightenment. Look at how Manson exploited his family. He didn't just want their company. He wanted their total submission to his helter-skelter vision. He exploited their youth, their labor, and eventually their very humanity, turning them into instruments of violence. He convinced them that killing was a revolutionary act. This was the ultimate exploitation, convincing a person to destroy their own soul for your own benefit. Now look at Keith Raniere. He was more corporate in his exploitation, but the mechanics were identical. He created a secret society called DOS, where women were referred to as slaves, and he was the Grand Master. He exploited them financially, emotionally, and physically. But he used a very specific psychological anchor called collateral. He required slaves to give him damaging information or photos of themselves as collateral to prove their commitment. As a counselor, I see this as a high-level form of blackmail psychology. He used their fear of exposure to keep them in a state of permanent exploitation. He turned their own vulnerabilities into a cage. But why do people stay when the exploitation starts? This is where the sunk cost fallacy comes in. By the time exploitation is visible, the victim has already given up so much. Their family, their money, their reputation. Their brain says, if I leave now, all of that sacrifice was for nothing. I have to keep going to make meaning of something. Manson and Raniere were experts in this. They pushed their followers to do things that were increasingly wrong, so that the followers would feel that they had no choice but to stay. They were all in. They had burned the bridges behind them. So why does all this matter to you? Why are we looking at these two men 50 years apart? Because while the names and the technology change, the human brain stays the same. The dark psychology used at the ranch in 1969 is the same psychology being used in toxic relationships, predatory workplaces, and online extremist groups today. As a licensed professional counselor, my goal is to help you see these patterns before you're all in. If you feel yourself being isolated from your support system, if your reality is being questioned by someone in power, or if you feel that your growth requires the erosion of your boundaries, that's not enlightenment. That is coercive control. Understanding this clinical file of the past is our best defense for the future. We don't study these monsters to give them more fame. We study them to take away their power by unmasking their methods. And that, my friends, closes another clinical file. If you found this psychological breakdown helpful, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. I'm John Cordray, and until next time, good day and good night.